When does U.S. history start and end? The history of this land doesn't begin in 1776 or even with the first English colonies. It began thousands of years earlier with the indigenous people of Turtle Island. Nations like Iroquois and Cherokee and Pueblo built thriving communities, cities, and trade networks. They had systems of government, agriculture, and spirituality long before Europeans arrived. Then came the 1400s and 1500s. When explorers and colonizers arrived from Europe, they brought disease, guns, and conquest that devastated native populations. By 1776, colonists declared independence from Britain, and the United States was officially born. But the real story doesn't end there. It keeps unfolding from slavery to civil rights, wars to protests. U.S. history is still being written today, in 2025, by the struggles and voices of its people.
If we follow a timeline, a few turning points stand out. The American Revolution lit the spark of independence. The Civil War tore the nation apart and ended slavery, though not racism. The Trail of Tears showed how the government forced Native people off their lands, leaving a scar of displacement and death. Fast forward to the 20th century. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s brought marches, boycotts, and speeches that challenged segregation and demanded equality. In the 21st century, events like the 9/11 attacks, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the George Floyd protests reshaped how America sees itself. Each event tells us that U.S. history is built on conflict, struggle, and moments that shift the nation forever.
The phases of history are as diverse as the land itself. During the Revolution, leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin helped form a new nation. But we also must remember people like Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved poet who spoke about freedom even while being denied her own. In the fight against slavery, Frederick Douglass used his voice to expose its cruelty, Harriet Tubman risked her life leading people to freedom, and Sojourner Truth, who challenged both slavery and women's rights. Indigenous leaders like Tecumseh and Sitting Bull resisted U.S. expansion into their homelands. The Civil Rights era gave us some of the most powerful leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. called for nonviolent protests and inspired millions with his dream of equality. But Malcolm X represented another side of the struggle. He spoke fiercely against racism, exposing the hypocrisy of America's so-called freedom. He argued that black people had the right to defend themselves, to control their communities, and to demand liberation, not beg for it. His speeches shook the nation, and his assassination in 1965 left behind ideas that lived on. In modern times, figures like Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, and Angela Davis represent the ongoing struggles for justice, representation, and liberation. Together, these people remind us that history is written not only by presidents, but by revolutionaries, organizers, and ordinary people who choose to fight back.
Geography tells its own story. Washington, D.C. is the heart of political power, where decisions shape the nation and protests demand change. Philadelphia is where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed, marking the official birth of the United States. New York City became the gateway for millions of immigrants through Ellis Island, the engine of finance on Wall Street, and the site of the tragedy on September 11, 2001. Boston gave us the spark of the revolution with the Boston Tea Party, an early protest against Britain, and in the South, Montgomery, Alabama, became the cradle of the civil rights movement, where bus boycotts and marches pushed America closer to its promises of equality. These places aren't just cities, but landmarks of struggle, power, and change.
The truth is, America is not good. Its story is built on stolen land and forced labor. Indigenous nations were massacred, displaced, and forced into reservations. Families getting torn apart. At the same time, millions of African Americans were kidnapped, chained in ships, and sold onto slavery to fuel the nation's economy. Cotton, tobacco, and rice, products that have built America's wealth, were grown through brutal forced labor. Even after slavery ended in 1865, America created a new system to keep people of color oppressed. Jim Crow laws legalized segregation, lynch mobs terrorized black communities, Native children were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools, meaning to erase their culture. And today, mass incarceration, poverty, and police violence continue the same cycle. America tells the world it stands for freedom, but that freedom has been selective for most of its history. The foundation of the United States is rooted in exploitation and oppression. Residents' movements, led by indigenous leaders, abolitionists, and civil rights activists, showing the courage of the people, but the nation itself was built on exploitation.
So when we look at U.S. history, its beginnings, events, people, places, and legacy, we see a story not of greatness, but of struggle. A story of those who were oppressed and those who resisted. And that story continues today, as the following chapters are still being written. Thanks for joining us on this journey through U.S. history.